I am 77 years old. Last Sunday morning, Eleanor and I decided to finally clear out the heavy wooden chest that sits at the end of the hallway upstairs. It is one of those pieces of furniture that slowly becomes a graveyard for things you do not want to throw away, but never actually look at. I was kneeling on the carpet, pulling out old tax folders and heavy winter blankets, when my hand brushed against a thick, leather-bound photo album. I pulled it out and opened it randomly. I found myself staring at a photograph taken almost exactly 17 years ago, on my 60th birthday. We were standing in the backyard of our old house. I sat there on the hallway floor for a very long time, just looking at the man in that picture. The truth is, that man looked fundamentally sicker and significantly older than the man I am today. His face was puffy and carried a heavy, dull redness. His eyes looked tired, surrounded by dark, swollen tissue. Even the way his hands rested on the back of a lawn chair looked stiff, the knuckles visibly inflamed. I remember exactly how I felt on that day. I felt a constant, low-level ache in my lower back, a persistent fog in my mind, and a heavy, dragging exhaustion that I had simply accepted as the undeniable cost of turning 60. Looking at that photograph, I realized with a profound sense of clarity that the physical decay I was experiencing back then was not actually aging. It was a completely different, silent, and incredibly destructive biological fire that I was unknowingly fueling every single day of my life. I am sharing this specific realization with you because I wish someone had sat me down and explained what I am about to tell you when I was in my 50s. For the vast majority of my adult life, I held a completely passive, almost fatalistic view of how the human body breaks down. I believed that aging was just the inevitable passage of time wearing out the machinery. I thought our joints got stiff because they had been used too much. I thought our skin thinned and our memory faded simply because the calendar pages kept turning. I watched my own father age in Ohio, and he embodied this exact philosophy. By the time he was in his late 60s, every morning was a struggle. He would sit on the edge of his bed, rubbing his knees, waiting for his body to warm up enough to walk to the kitchen. He accepted the pain as a mandatory tax on survival. He used to say that getting old meant learning how to live with the aches. I absorbed that lesson completely. I assumed that the stiffness, the puffiness, and the creeping lethargy I felt at 60 were just my own mandatory taxes coming due. I carried that grim assumption into my retirement. But the stiffness did not just stay in my joints. It felt like it was spreading into my mind and my overall vitality. I started having days where concentrating on a simple book felt like wading through deep water. My doctor would run his standard blood panels, look at the numbers, and tell me everything was within the normal range for a man my age. But the phrase "for a man my age" started to sound less like a medical assessment and more like a polite dismissal. I did not want to feel normal for my age if normal meant feeling like I was slowly rusting from the inside out. I knew enough from my decades in the publishing industry to understand that when a narrative does not make sense, you have to dig into the underlying text. I wanted to know what was actually causing that profound systemic stiffness. The turning point for me happened during a long, quiet conversation with my daughter, Rebecca. As a clinical nutritionist, she has an incredible ability to look past the symptoms and identify the foundational mechanics of the body. We were walking through the neighborhood one evening, and I was complaining about how my hands felt tight and sore after spending just an hour holding garden shears. I told her I felt like my body was constantly fighting a war I could not see. Rebecca stopped walking and looked at me. She told me I was exactly right, and she used a word I had never heard before. She called it inflammaging. She explained that the acute inflammation you get when you twist your ankle is a healthy temporary response. But as we get older, our immune systems often become confused and hyperactive. They start releasing a constant low-grade stream of inflammatory chemicals into the bloodstream, even when there is no injury to fight. This chronic inflammation does not just make your joints hurt. It acts like a slow, smoldering fire that literally burns through healthy tissue, accelerates cognitive decline, and creates the exact environment that terrifying diseases need to take root. But what she told me next was the part that sent me back to my study to read for weeks. She explained that this smoldering fire of chronic inflammation is not just damaging the surface of the cells, it is penetrating deep into the nucleus and physically damaging our DNA. I spent my life working with manuscripts and printing presses. I understand the concept of a master copy. Our DNA is the master manuscript of the human body. It contains the exact instructions for rebuilding every single cell perfectly. Rebecca explained that chronic inflammation acts like someone constantly spilling acidic coffee all over those master pages. The letters get blurred. The instructions get corrupted. When a cell tries to divide and rebuild itself using a corrupted manuscript, it makes mistakes. Those mistakes manifest as aging, as tissue degradation, and ultimately, as rogue, mutated cells that forget how to behave. I realized with absolute horror that the puffiness and stiffness I saw in that photograph of myself at 60 were not just superficial signs of getting older. They were the visible smoke from a fire that was actively destroying my genetic manuscript. I sat in my worn leather chair the next morning, surrounded by notebooks, and started researching how the body protects its own DNA. I refuse to believe that we are engineered to simply let this fire burn until the manuscript is completely destroyed. I read about cellular biology, trying to find the body's internal fire suppression system. What I found was a biological mechanism so elegant and powerful that I could not understand why it was not common knowledge. I discovered that locked inside our cells is a specific protein pathway called NRF2. You do not need to remember the acronym, but you need to understand what it does. I read that this pathway is essentially the master editor and the chief of the fire department combined into one. When this pathway is activated, it travels directly into the nucleus of the cell and binds to the DNA. It flips a massive genetic switch that commands the body to produce its own powerful internal antioxidants. It floods the system with enzymes that seek out and extinguish the chronic inflammation. But even more miraculously, it activates the specific genes responsible for repairing broken and corrupted DNA strands. It literally fixes the typos in the manuscript. The problem, I learned, is that as we age, and as we are exposed to modern diets and environmental stress, this master switch gets stuck in the off position. The fire burns, the DNA degrades, and the repair crew stays asleep. I desperately wanted to know how to reach inside my own cells and flip that switch back on. I assumed the answer would be a complex pharmaceutical intervention or some impossibly expensive synthetic compound. But the literature kept pointing me in a completely different, almost absurdly simple direction. The most potent, scientifically documented activator of this DNA-repairing, inflammation-killing pathway was not a drug. It was a specific, naturally occurring compound called sulforaphane, and its highest concentration in the natural world is found in something I had previously considered a completely useless garnish: 3-day-old broccoli sprouts. I remember staring at the pages of my notebook, feeling a mixture of profound relief and deep skepticism. I had spent decades looking for answers in doctors' offices, and the biology papers were telling me the master switch to my cellular health was locked inside a tiny, fragile plant. I read study after study detailing how the sulforaphane compound from these specific sprouts enters the bloodstream, penetrates the cell wall, and physically interacts with the NRF2 protein, forcing it to wake up, enter the nucleus, and start the massive repair protocol. I was reading clinical observations of inflammatory markers dropping precipitously and markers of DNA protection skyrocketing, simply from the daily introduction of this specific botanical compound. I decided that day that I was going to flood my body with it. Before I tell you exactly how I incorporated this into my daily life, and the incredibly common fundamental mistake that completely destroys the healing power of this food before it even reaches your stomach, I want to pause for a second. Many of you who watch these videos regularly and find value in these quiet discoveries have not actually subscribed to the channel yet. If you feel that these conversations are helping you rethink how you manage your own health as you age, Please take a moment to check if you are subscribed. It helps us keep doing this, and it ensures we can keep sharing these vital pieces of the puzzle together. Now, let me tell you about the reality of making this work, because the chemistry is incredibly fragile. When I first decided to start eating broccoli sprouts, I made the exact mistake that almost everyone makes when they try to adopt this habit. I went to the grocery store, bought a plastic clamshell of mature broccoli and a small container of sprouts. I brought them home, threw them into a hot frying pan with a little olive oil and some eggs, and cooked them for breakfast. I did this for a week, waiting to feel that profound cellular shift I had read about. I felt absolutely nothing. The stiffness in my hands remained. The fog in my head did not lift. I mentioned my new breakfast routine to Rebecca over the phone, and I heard her sigh deeply on the other end of the line. She told me I was wasting my time and my money, because I had fundamentally misunderstood how the chemistry of the plant actually works. She explained that the miraculous compound sulforaphane does not actually exist in the intact sprout. It is a defense mechanism. The sprout contains two separate components stored in different compartments within its cells: a precursor compound called glucoraphanin and an active enzyme called myrosinase. In nature, these two things only mix when a bug bites into the plant and crushes the cells. When they mix, a chemical reaction occurs that creates the sulforaphane. Rebecca told me that the enzyme, myrosinase, is incredibly sensitive to heat. By throwing those sprouts into a hot frying pan, I had instantly killed the enzyme. Without the enzyme, the chemical reaction cannot happen. I was eating cooked greens, but I was getting absolutely zero DNA-repairing sulforaphane. I was essentially throwing the fire extinguisher into the fire. She also warned me against simply swallowing them whole in a salad, because the reaction requires physical crushing to break the cell walls and mix the compounds. You have to do the mechanical work. You cannot just casually swallow them. I had to completely change my approach. I realized that if I wanted the true, raw biological power of this compound, I had to treat it with the respect its chemistry demanded. I stopped buying the sad, wilting sprouts in the plastic containers at the store. I realized they were often days or weeks old, and the volatile compounds had already degraded. I decided to take absolute control over the process. I bought a large bag of organic broccoli sprouting seeds and a few wide-mouthed glass mason jars with mesh lids. I set them up on the windowsill in my kitchen, right next to the sink. Every single morning, as part of my routine, I spend exactly 2 minutes rinsing the seeds with fresh water and tipping the jars to let them drain. It is not gardening. It is simple daily maintenance. Within 3 to 4 days, the jars are packed tightly with vibrant, pale yellow and green sprouts. This is when the concentration of the precursor compounds is at its absolute mathematical peak. My daily protocol is incredibly specific, and I do not deviate from it. Every day at lunch, I pull a large handful of those fresh sprouts out of the jar. I do not cook them. I do not heat them in any way. I put them directly onto whatever I am eating, usually a piece of fish or a simple salad. But the most critical part of the protocol happens in the mouth. I do not just chew them casually. I chew them deliberately, thoroughly, and aggressively. I make sure I am mechanically crushing every single tiny stem and leaf between my teeth before I swallow. As you chew them, you can actually taste the chemical reaction happening. They start out tasting like mild lettuce, and suddenly they develop a sharp, peppery, almost horseradish-like bite. That sharp heat you feel on your tongue is the exact moment the myrosinase enzyme mixes with the precursor, creating the raw sulforaphane. When I taste that heat, I know I am sending the correct signal down into my body. I know I am delivering the master key that will unlock the NRF2 pathway. It took about 6 weeks of this uncompromising daily habit before the silent shifts in my body became undeniable. It did not happen all at once. It was a gradual, quiet receding of the tide. The first thing I noticed was my hands. I woke up one morning, reached for my coffee mug, and realized my knuckles were not screaming at me. The deep, tight, swollen feeling that usually accompanied the first hour of my day was simply gone. I could make a tight fist without feeling like the skin was going to tear. As the months went on, the heavy, persistent fog in my mind began to clear. I felt a sharpness and a mental endurance that I had not experienced in over a decade. I was no longer waking up feeling like I was already behind in a physical battle. The most profound realization came much later, when I went back to the doctor for my annual blood work. The markers for systemic inflammation, the numbers that had always hovered in that high normal range that doctors dismiss as just part of getting older, had plummeted. They were sitting at levels you would expect to see in a man 20 years younger. The smoldering fire in my tissues had been largely extinguished. The internal environment of my body had shifted from a state of chronic destruction to a state of active daily repair. I look back at that photograph of myself at 60, with the puffy face and the exhausted eyes, and I feel a profound sense of agency. We are taught to look at physical decline as a one-way street. We are conditioned to believe that once the DNA starts degrading and the inflammation takes hold, our only option is to manage the decline with heavier and heavier medications. We treat the symptoms of the fire while completely ignoring the mechanism that can put it out. But the master manuscript inside your cells desperately wants to be read correctly. The repair crew is still there, waiting in the dark for the right chemical signal to wake up and start fixing the damage. You do not have to accept the narrative that your joints must hurt, your mind must fade, and your cells must inevitably mutate as you age. You have the power to change the chemical instructions you send to your body every single day. The intervention does not always require a prescription pad. Sometimes it requires a glass jar, a handful of seeds, and the willingness to understand the profound mechanics of your own biology. The body warns before it collects. Most people notice too late what had been warning them for years. I am telling you this because I wish someone had told me earlier. Aging well starts with what you stop ignoring. Some damage happens silently until one day it doesn't happen anymore. You do not need fear, you need attention.